Ladies and gentlemen, let's RedGamerTed.com video. We're going to be discussing PC CPUs and if games in the future are going to become much more multi-thread reliant with the release of the Xbox 720 and the PlayStation 4. Just the other day I did a video discussing just how CPUs from the PC stack up against the AMD Jaguar, which of course lies at the heart of the PlayStation 4 and most likely the next generation Xbox. As most of you are doubtlessly aware by now, the CPU inside the PlayStation 4 is actually an 8-core AMD Jaguar, which of course is an x86/64 hybrid. Now I think by now many of you will have probably, if you're regular viewers at least, understand that the PlayStation 4's CPU is simply not up to scratch of the ridiculously powerful systems of the PC. Indeed, in many cases it's several times slower. However, the fact that the CPU of the PlayStation 4 and Xbox 720 are likely going to rely heavily upon multi-threading could well be a great thing for PC gamers. Indeed, many of you will likely be aware that certain engines now are becoming increasingly dependent upon multi-threads. One simple example of recent releases would be Crysis 3. Traditionally, the AMD CPUs are considerably slower, at least up until recently, of Intel. Now, this wasn't always the case. In times of, say, the Athlon 939 and so on, they were extremely competitive. However, they haven't really been competitive, especially since the, say, Sandy Bridge and Ivory Bridge range has been released. However, recent reveals, shall we say, of Crysis 3 performance on both CPUs of Intel and AMD are showing that the tides are turning, and indeed AMD are becoming increasingly competitive because, as it turns out, Crysis 3 is extremely CPU intensive. Indeed, it's very good at actually placing multiple threads on the hardware, in other words, getting the most out of all of your cores. AMD's FX 8350 is actually very much in line with the Core i7 3770K, and indeed actually slightly pips it to the post. So further comments from various people in the tech industry, it's becoming obvious that, quite simply put, multi-core is definitely the way forward. If you were to take a look, for example, at the typical PC, it's anything between 2 to 8 cores. 4 cores are now becoming extremely standard, and even the Xbox 360 actually could handle 6 hardware threads, but on 3 physical cores. I'm not going to bother to list all of them, of course. So, one of the reasons that the i5 range, for example, has actually been beating, say, the FX 8350 is, quite simply put, that most games now don't really rely upon that many threads. However, parallelization now is becoming increasingly popular because, as it turns out, it's going to most likely become the standard since, well, most games on the PC are either port or based upon the same engines as the Xbox and the, of course, PS4 versions. That's not to say, of course, that the games won't run perfectly fine if you have, say, an i5, which of course has 4 physical cores with no hyperthreading, but it's likely that they are certainly going to become increasingly supportive of such ways of computing, if you will. You've also got to remember one of the issues that many developers are having right now is that quite oftentimes they have to make an engine which runs on both the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3. Now, bear in mind there is quite a lot of difference in the actual CPU core architecture of both systems. We've already discussed the Xbox 360, which actually has 3 physical cores with 6 hardware threads. The PS3, on the other hand, actually has 1 core which handles 2 hardware threads as well as 6 SPUs. Linus Bloomberg, who acts as the Chief Technical Officer at Avalanche Studios, indeed, has been quoted in saying, "Getting a common game architecture to run across both the Xbox 360 and PS3 is no easy feat, and you have to take the lowest common denominator sometimes. This can mean that you have an engine which is supposed to be wide, in other words, running across parallel across many cores, and end up having bottlenecks where it can actually only run on a single core for a part of the frame. And to continue, this usually isn't an issue, except when you come across to scaling it to a PC architecture. If your engine works in a certain way, then running more in parallel helps for part of the frame, but you still get stuck on bottlenecks. This is why I think that most games that are ported to PC work with fewer, more powerful cores, like the i5. The single-threaded grunt is enough for you to get through the bottlenecks and drive faster frame rates. As I was saying earlier, a lot of the time AMD are actually typically slower, just because most of the time they go for more cores, whereas on the other hand, typically AMD lose out in terms of sheer single-threaded grunt, which obviously Intel are definitely leading the charge on. Of course, for PCs it's not generally that simple. There is also other factors to take into consideration, such as, for example, overclocking. Anyone who's been into PCs for a certain amount of time knows heavily about overclocking. And indeed, back in the days of Quake 3, quite a few people were buying, say, cheap Celeron 300As, and they were overclocking them all the way up to 450 megahertz, which was quite astounding, actually, considering the price of the CPUs at the time. And it's by no means the only example of this. Intel's own 2500K can overclock absolutely ridiculous speeds. It turbos itself up to 3.7, but you can certainly get up to 4.5. Some people even higher, up to say 5 gigahertz, depending upon cooling, of course, a lot of the time. And indeed, other CPUs such as the AMD Venice, which is fairly old now, of course, and is only a single core, but I believe was 1.8 gigahertz standard, can be overclocked all the way up to 2.7, at least I got mine up to back in the day. And that was on a stock cooler, believe it or not. My point being that CPUs on the PC are a lot more complicated to really ascertain clock speeds with. But newer engines, such as, let's say, Frostbite 3, and of course CryEngine 3, which of course lies at the heart of Crysis 3, and one of the reasons that indeed Crysis 3 is doing so well on high amount of cores is basically that the engine has been built with the future in mind. In other words, they know that their next generation of consoles needs an engine design that's quite capable of actually running across multiple cores, which of course engines just a few years ago weren't so good about that. For those who are looking to buy a new CPU now, it's of course becoming extremely difficult to really decide what to do. I regularly do tech videos which are going to, do explain the best value parts, but honestly right now it's an extreme gamble. 1155 sockets, which are, for example, for Ivy Bridge, are now being phased out, and the 1150 standard is going to be replacing that, which is going to be for the Haswell architecture, and that's going to be sometime in this summer. AMD's architecture, however, which is AM3 Plus socket, is still current and most likely will be around for possibly at least one more CPU generation, if not more, but we are pretty certain it's going to be around for at least one more. AMD are a lot more merciful with the socket upgrades. We're also, of course, going to be seeing AMD's own Steamroller technology, which is going to be released likely later this year. The benefits of Steamroller are going to be mostly single-threaded improvements, whereas AMD have been very much pushing the multi-threaded route. As I've been saying throughout this video, the single thread is actually very much lacking, and for older applications or for applications that don't really require the wide approach, it's a problem. Even games right now, to be honest, most of them really don't take advantage of multiple threads, at least as well as they should. In fact, if you've got a multi-core CPU, you can actually do some testing yourself by simply, loading up any application and taking a look, especially this is even better if you've got multiple monitors, and taking a look at your CPU usage. Up until recently, most games were barely using more than 2 cores, but now it's becoming a lot better. So hopefully AMD can start getting a leg up, if you will, with Steamroller, because they've got quite a lot of flack actually in the past from expectations of being faster, but in reality they've always been slightly behind the times. Now, of course, AMD are also putting a lot of their faith in the Fusion technology or Trinity, such as AMD, the APUs. Now, the APUs are one of the reasons, or the APU is one of the reasons that the PlayStation 4 is able to put out the very good graphics that it does. It's going to be shifting a lot of the work over to the GPU, which of course is very good at parallel tasks. So, one of the real changes AMD are envisaging, even on the desktops, is APU design, and they're in fact betting quite a lot on this. Some have even said betting the company. I don't really think it's going quite that far, but they certainly are expecting more and more shift, or more and more of a shift towards the APU designs. So I think it's going to be a very interesting time for PCs. In a respect, it's very good that the PlayStation 4 and Xbox 720 are going to be released and so reliant upon multi-threads, because quite simply put, it gives developers a lot more flexibility. I've been saying for a while now that one of the issues of the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, other than the fact that it has graphical limitations, it's been holding back technology. And despite the fact that, of course, you can actually use multiple threads on the PC, it's sometimes not that easy. And to be honest with you, by the time you've actually already coded the technology in and said, hey, you know what, this CPU is controlling this CPU is controlling that, it kind of becomes a bit of a pain in the ass to redo all this. And that's one of the reasons that a lot of people, especially developers, are very happy about the multi-threaded approach to the PlayStation 4, as well as the multi-thread aspects of it. That isn't to say, of course, the PlayStation 4's CPU is perfect. As I've said previously, it is somewhat lackluster in comparison to the higher-end desktops, and indeed, in terms of raw performance, you're not going to be really that much better off than, say, an i3 for a PC. But you've got to bear in mind as well that it's not a simple case of faster with a console. It's also to do with power requirements, heat, and so on. And some people have actually said, you know, I've read various comments and so on, that I don't understand why they went with the Jaguar design. I don't understand why they were so concerned with, you know, power when it's plugged into the wall. But of course, it's not really just to do with power, it's also about cooling the damn thing, as well as the amalgamation with the APU, as well as costs. Honestly speaking, there always has to be some concessions made to a console. No one can expect, realistically at least, and reasonably expect a £300 console, just for example, to have in all the latest stuff. I mean, you know, you can't expect something like a GTX Titan in there, and I don't know, you know, like an 8-core Sandy Bridge or Ivy Bridge or something. It's just not realistic and feasible. There has to be some concessions made. Speaking of concessions, I think this is actually a very good thing for the PC market as well. This is for a number of reasons. Now, I know I've been speaking a lot about consoles, but to be honest with you, my first love is PCs. Now, that's nothing against the console market. You guys know that I love consoles as well. I indeed own both the Xbox 360 and PS3. I like to throw that in sometimes just to illustrate that I'm not particularly biased. However, I do love PCs more, just because of the freedom of computing on them. That's just my personal preference, of course. You guys may vary. I have friends who absolutely hate playing on PCs for various reasons, including controls and configurations and so on. And I have other friends who absolutely detest playing on consoles. I have actually other friends who've bought tons of consoles and then they play them for a couple of days and then they get rid of them. So there you have it. Regardless, as I was saying, PCs have always been seen as extremely expensive to game on, and I think it's becoming increasingly notable that this isn't actually the case. If you were to take a look at the market right now, there are actually some good CPUs and GPUs on the market that can quite easily handle 1080p gaming, not necessarily with high levels of AA and AF and all the other gooders, but certainly a decent resolution. And indeed, if you're even more willing to, say, drop down to 720p, which generally speaking is higher than most consoles are actually rendering internally for most games anyway, then you're going to be having a very good time with it. For example, if you were to take a look at the prices of, say, the Intel, the i7s, for example, from Intel, they're around $100 more expensive than AMD's alternative. And honestly, the fact that AMD becoming increasingly competitive is only good because it's only a good thing because it's going to drive down the prices. More to the point, even if it doesn't, even if the prices do remain stagnant, it's very good because it's also going to give people choices. Now, I know what people are going to say. It's only £100 more, or $100 more, whatever your currency is, for this CPU. But you've got to also remember that by the time people start to factor in the graphics card and everything else, it can often be a lot more expensive. And some people have quite limited budgets. Others are used to console prices. And I think there are some, I don't want to turn this into a PC versus console, but I think quite a few people now are starting to realize that there is a significant difference in price between console games and PC games. This is due to a number of reasons. Specifically, of course, they're not having to pay licensing fees to, say, Sony or Microsoft, and other ones such as they know that you cannot simply resell the games. It has to do with other reasons as well, but I'm just going to keep it short for now. So the fact that cheaper hardware is going to become, I wouldn't use the word prevalent, but certainly more, well, yeah, I'd say prevalent. It's going to become a lot more affordable and a lot more abundant, and to the point where you can actually build yourself a really good machine that can quite easily take on the PS4 and other consoles. I'm not necessarily saying beat them graphically, but you can certainly build yourself a machine or turn it into an existing desktop into a pretty good gaming system. This wide approach, also known as more cores, is great for other things too, including, but not limited to, advances in AI and physics. And I know I keep banging on about that. People may even detest the words by now, but honestly speaking, I don't care how great the graphics are. Well, I do. That's a complete lie and fabrication. But honestly speaking, be honest about this. Do you really want to play a game that only looks good as still images? No, of course not. That doesn't make sense. You want to see the dust and the debris and the smoke and the leaves blowing in the trees, or the bricks falling realistically, because you want better indestructible environments. You want characters to fall correctly, or even if you're not interested in violent games, fighting games, for example, or shooters or RPGs. I mean, wouldn't it be nice if, for example, you're playing an RPG and the clothing move realistically when casting a spell, or say the water move better, or even if you're not into that at all, let's say you're just a die-hard sports person. I'm not, personally. Some of you regular viewers may know I do bodybuilding, but other than that, I don't really like playing sports. But let's say you do. Wouldn't it be much better if, say, you're able to actually physically see various aspects of the characters move better physics of, say, the ball, and even ragdoll physics, for example, if you're playing, I don't know, NFL or something like that, or hockey, and so it gets knocked off the feet. There's just so much more that can be done in terms of physics. And if we were to take a look at pretty much everything else as well, AI and scripting, people are always yelling at the dummy of AI. Indeed, I'm actually going to get one of my friends who is studying actually AI programming. I'm going to try and get him to do a video with me at some point in the not too distant future. But I was actually having a discussion with him the other day, and he was mirroring quite a lot of what I was saying, in that there are a couple of things holding back AI. One is that we just simply don't know all of the techniques. And by AI, I'm not talking about creating Skynet level here. I'm not saying that we want the machines to control us. I'm simply saying more advanced AI, we're actually learning more on the job. But also, as well, the simple fact of the matter is that there is limited CPU cycles. So with advances in CPU power for the consoles and so on, this is certainly going to be a step forward. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if eventually we're going to have various different levels of AI, maybe even some that are rendered on the GPU, which is definitely a possibility in the case of the PlayStation 4, and most likely the Xbox 720, depending on its structure. Like it or lump it, as the saying may go, certain tasks just are not that well suited for GPU rendering. Others are. Physics, for example, especially on NVIDIA, of course, automatically hardware supports it. So, for example, I have a GTX 600 series card, and physics is supported in hardware, which looks pretty damn great on certain games that support it. Unfortunately, in my opinion, not quite as many do as I'd like, but that's the different whiny story. On the other hand, on the PlayStation 4 and Xbox, well, I'm not so sure about the Xbox, but certainly on PlayStation 4, the video have already come out and said that they are supporting it. We're not so sure about how. If I had to guess, it would most likely be hardware support, because I would pity the CPU if it was trying to do advanced physics on that. So it's most likely going to be one or two of the GCN cores. Indeed, there were murmurs before the PS4 was announced, and it was during the rumours stage when it was known as Orbis, that I think it was 4 of the GCN cores. I most likely got that wrong. I'm pretty sure it was 4. But were actually dedicated as compute units, which could mean AI or physics or any of the other wonderful things that parallel computing generally brings. And of course, this is only going to become more and more commonplace. Indeed, I'm going to give you guys a bit of a funny story. This is actually a true one. Back in the day, not super long ago, but back when the Q6600s, which of course were the predecessors of the Core 2 Duos and the Core 2 Quads, were the big thing from Intel, and well before the i5 range and so on were around. There were 2 and 4 core variants that were generally available, and I believe it was the E8400 was the big thing on the market right then, because it could overclock extremely well. And I got into a series of arguments with one of the posters on a forum, because they were championing the E8400, which was a dual-core solution. And the debate got quite heated, although there were quite strict rules in the forums, so there weren't any swearing or anything like that. And I honestly could not understand, I couldn't fathom why he was advocating the E8400. And I understood his reasoning behind the whole overclocking thing, and I basically got into a series of links with him. In other words, link exchange. You know that wonderful thing on the internet where both of you are sending links to the other one to try and prove your point? And he was obviously showing links that were favouring his things, and I was doing the same. But in the end, I won the argument, and my post was what got the person to eventually buy the Q6600 instead. And as it turns out, the chap was quite thankful for it. Now, the E8400 now isn't a terrible CPU. It's good for general purpose stuff, but even overclocked, games are starting to struggle with it. On the other hand, the Q6600, if overclocked especially, its actually default clock speed is, I believe, 2.4 GHz, but it can pretty easily be overclocked to, assuming you've got a decent motherboard, 3 GHz or 3.2. Now that might sound like quite a bit of a detriment, or, quite a bit of a deficit between the two speeds, but you've got to take into account that games are not going to be stagnant, and to be honest with you, most of the time your CPU will last you for quite a while, providing it's got enough grunt. Now, the Q6600 is still a pretty good CPU. My point being that I knew that games were going to become a lot more increasingly dependent on threads. This was just fairly obvious to me. I physically didn't understand how this chap couldn't understand this with the advent and the release of the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 3, and just a couple of months later, actually, you had certain games like Grand Theft Auto 4 being released, and they basically cried every time that they were being forced to run on these dual-core monsters. Why? Because it doesn't matter if they're dual-core or quad-core. To the game's developer, the fact of the matter is that they actually designed the game in mind for the console. And as it turns out, the console, quite simply had more threads. And so it felt kind of strangled running even on a faster dual-core system. I merely use this to point out the simple fact that games now are becoming increasingly reliant upon multi-core, especially now the consoles are as well. This is only a good thing in my opinion. It's simply put going to give the tools and facilitate the tools for developers to be able to push a lot further. Now, in one respect, the PS4's lackluster, if you will, and I use that in a very respectful term. It's not to say that the CPU, or should I say the PS4's performance as a whole is going to be lackluster. I merely meant the CPU itself. it does somewhat worry me because obviously the average PC is not going to be an APU design, but I don't really think it's going to be too much of a problem. In actuality, I think that because it's x86 architecture, it's going to be a lot easier for them to actually, what's the word? Make full use of, I believe, would be the best way to put it. I think it's going to be a lot easier for them to make use of faster CPU speeds. So, what about advice? I don't really want to turn this into a buying advice video. I do frequent buying advice, and to be honest as well, because it's come to my attention that videos are not always the best form. I try to be as clear as possible and descriptive as possible in the video, but sometimes it's just better to actually give model numbers and so on rather than having you guys keep replaying them. So I've also decided for those particular videos that I'm going to be doing them via articles as well. So for those of you who just want to watch it on YouTube or what have you, on the way to work, that's cool, and you can note down stuff. But as well, if you want to say upgrade your graphics card and you're wondering which graphics card to go, you can go ahead and do the articles. We're definitely going to start pushing the website more. I actually need to sort out a few bits on it. There is still some niggling issues in regards to the layout and server speeds that I really do need to get my ass in gear for. But you know what it's like, there's always something extra you need to do, unfortunately. Such is life, as they say. But yeah, I'm actually very happy with the news about this PS4 CPU. I was actually quite giddy at the fact it's x86. I'm somewhat disappointed in the overall performance. As I've said before, I've done a video on that and an article on RGT. I know I was a bit slow on that. I was a day slower than I was supposed to, but unfortunately yesterday I had pretty bad headache. And I don't really like to work when I've got a headache because personally I tend to miss stuff. I know that's not particularly good, maybe excuse, but generally speaking, when I'm dealing with numbers and benchmarks and that kind of thing, I like to actually have a clear head because I don't like to make mistakes. That's not to say, of course, that I'm faultless, but I like to minimize the risk. So I've had to do the article today, so that's up and available. So you guys can go to redgamingtech.com, and I've also got another video, which is basically, I don't remember the exact name, but something like how does a PS4 Jaguar CPU stack up against the desktops, and there's some good information there, I believe, anyway, and there's also the link there directly to the article. So I'll probably end this video with that video on the extra, so you guys can check that out if you've not already done so. So anyway, I think that's just about it I want to cover for this one. There is a lot of stuff that I will be covering in the not too distant future. So hopefully you've enjoyed the video, and I will see you soon. Take care, and bye for now.